afternoon. We are working ourselves through some material that can be really tricky to understand and really challenging to get our heads around in First Peter. And it's the first 7 verses of what's going on in First Peter chapter 3. Our tendency in letters is to chunk them out and read them in snippets, especially when they're broken up by headings in our Bibles or when a chapter divides a flow of thought. And so, I mean, if you've read the article and now you're watching this video as a sort of piece at the end here, then you sort of got a layout for this. And so I want to address it this way. The way Peter presents wives in chapter 3 and the call of the wife in the Christian household and the Christian marriage is as an example of the way Jesus lived his life. And that, I think, really captures this idea of what it looks like to be strong and yet meek. Peter uses the words gentle and quiet in spirit. And he talks about the imperishable beauty of the hidden person of the heart. And that, I think, is really critically important, because here's the deal. Peter holds out as an example wives, as they live like Christ, actually demonstrate everything he's been talking about what it looks like to live as that royal priesthood, that holy nation, that people set apart by the call of God. And in Peter's flow of thought here, it's not husbands who are demonstrating, it's wives. He actually calls wives to win their husbands to the gospel without a word, with the conduct of their lives, with the imperishable beauty that he talks about. But if we're going to back play what's going on in chapter 3 into the rest of the thought flow, it's the honor with which they live. And so I said this in the article, but I'll say it again here. Christian marriages work best when husbands make much of their wives as they celebrate, as they encourage, as they honor and respect and hold in high regard the way their wives demonstrate the character of Jesus Christ. And Christian marriages work best when wives respect and honor and love their husbands, especially for those ways in which husbands love and lead and care for their wives like Christ. Because really what's in chapter 3, verse 7 is to honor the women in our lives, my wife, and to demonstrate from my daughters what it looks like for Jesus to hold my wife in high regard and to treat her well and to recognize and acknowledge how wonderful she is and how much she does, even when what she desires most or what she needs most isn't available to her because I'm oblivious to it, or because we have 4 young children, or fill in the blank, whatever it happens to be. And so here's the reality. When we pull the first 7 verses of chapter 3 in 1 Peter out of the flow of thought that is the rest of the letter, it becomes really cumbersome, really difficult, and really hard to navigate, especially today, the language of submit and the language of be subject to. But when we consider it in the flow of thought in Peter's letter, this is something that happens mutually. This is something we're called to in every aspect and area of our lives. In chapter 2, he tells us to be subject to every human institution, and he tells us to honor the emperor and to consider the authority of the governor and fill in the blank. And so Christians have been called throughout the letter to find those individuals in their lives with authority and sort of voluntarily be subject to those individuals, to yield our will to someone else And in chapter 3, that's no different when it comes to Christian marriages. He calls wives to respect their husbands. He calls wives to demonstrate Christ-like conduct as they engage their husbands. And he calls husbands, and this is revolutionary for the time frame that he's in, and I can't emphasize that enough. He spends more time talking to the wives, but he considers them the example of what Christ-like conduct looks like. Husbands, he doesn't assume that we're the Christ-like example of anything, which should be a rather scathing challenge to us as husbands. Peter considers wives to be the Christ-like example, and he looks at husbands and he says, guys, get your act together. Honor your wife. And he uses the word weaker, and we recoil at the word, and I've spent a lot of time in the last few weeks trying to wrap my head around why that word, and it clicked when I started finding some resources that said, look, this is a consistent paradigm for how the scripture talks about Jesus as he engages things like his betrayal and arrest, his suffering, his persecution, his crucifixion. It is exactly because our wives are probably the best example of grace, especially when I don't want to say mistreated, but especially when we aren't the best at loving them and caretaking for them and going out of our way to serve and to love them like Christ loves the church. They are still, at least in my experience, our wives tend to be the most shining example of the strength and the grit of will and the grace of God to continue living like Jesus in front of us in our marriages. And so I wanted to take some time and process and unpack that a little bit more verbally, because I don't know that I hope that the writing does it some sense of justice. These passages are a challenge, and they're a challenge for us today, in a post-feminism sort of hyper-egalitarianism, and so I think it's important that we keep that in mind. But it hit me like a ton of bricks when I realized that Peter's holding wives up as the example because they will win their husbands without a word. It's not the other way around. The wives in this case are the example of what it looks like to live like Christ. And so I hope and pray that the article is a little bit insightful and that this helps that a little bit. I also hope and pray that all of us would see in the women in our lives a bit more of the character and the conduct of Christ in love and respect, in meekness, in this strength and grit of will with grace seasoned into it, and overlaying it, and that we would see in our wives the character and the conduct of Christ in life's challenges and adversity.